Good morning again to those of you who are here, to those of you who are streaming. And as I mentioned at the outset of the service, today is our patronal feast day. It's the day that we're going to honor our namesake and honor our patron and our heavenly advocate. And to do that, I would like to introduce you to the man whose name is on everything around here and say a few words about his life as tradition understands it. There are some parts of it that scholars are in disagreement over, but I'm going to give you what the tradition has to say a little bit about the gospel that also bears his name. As you know, I see David Kramer in the back, the head of our property committee. We take great care on our front doors. Mark's gospel is inscribed in the front doors, and the very center of our reredos as the story of Jesus as told by St. Mark. When I was trying to become ordained, I was in the Diocese of New York, and Mother Ann, known and remembered by many of you, was the head of my ordination group. And there was a test, and the test had 100 biblical quotations, and you needed to name the book. And I didn't do very well on this test, I can tell you that now, because I'm already hired. But this is one that I got right. It says, "A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked." This was the sort of thing that made a big impression on me in the Bible. This is Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. And it's a scene that takes place at the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's when Judas and the temple guards come, and there's a confrontation, and a kid takes off naked because he's been sleeping such. And this is considered by some scholars to be Mark's little signature in the gospel, in the same way that you might see in Renaissance paintings where the painter might paint his or her face into people in the crowd. And this is my opinion. In my opinion, Mark is the most major minor character in the New Testament. He is never the center of anything, but he seems to be at the edge of everything. So, for instance, Mark served both Paul and Peter. And the evidence we have about Mark's life comes from the New Testament. And the earliest of early writings that we have from the early church. And much of it hinges and is based on Acts 12:12. Where we hear that Mark's real name, full name, is John Mark, but he goes by Mark. In the scene, as you may remember, Herod Antipas, who is the guy who beheaded John the Baptist, is getting ready to kill Peter. Peter is imprisoned, and you may remember the story that the gates open by the angels, and Peter is released, and he's actually sort of freaked out by this. And it says as soon as Peter, realized this, that is, that he's released, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. So, if this is true, and the whole of the early church agrees that this is true, this is a little bit about our man, Mark. Mark grew up in Jerusalem. He grew up in a wealthy household. His father had died while he was still a boy. And that Mary's house, and therefore the household that Mark grew up in, was a place, a very important place in the early church. We know from the stories in the Acts of the Apostles, the house has a gate, that it's big enough to house people, to have a house church there, that Mary's mother has a servant. And in the early church, in particular Jerome, who was the early translator of the Bible, was very clear that the location of the so-called upper room, the upper room being the place of the Last Supper, being the place of the Pentecost event, which is the upper right corner of our reredos, was Mary's house, took place in the house that Mark grew up in. And the Orthodox Christians believe this to be true, and there is a St. Mark's church in Jerusalem that venerates the place of the upper room. Now, the upper room is now 25 to 30 feet below where Jerusalem sits now. As you know, today's Jerusalem is 40 feet above the Jerusalem of Jesus' day. And one of our Holy Land pilgrimages went there, and those of you who were on it will remember that Linda Andros, a member of our parish, sang the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, and it was one of the most incredible group spiritual experiences I've ever been a part of. So we also know that Mark was from a Levitical family. He was from a priestly family, which may account for the fact that he knows the Hebrew Scriptures so well. So Mark is well-to-do, and he's also well-educated. So Mark speaks all the languages of Jesus. Jesus, of course, they all speak Aramaic, right? The root of Arabic now, and that was the common parlance of Jerusalem and Judea and that whole part of the world. We know that Mark spoke and wrote Greek. The gospel is written in Greek. It's Koine Greek, the common Greek. It's not high literary stuff, but he knows it. And we know that Mark knows Hebrew. Jesus knowing Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew too, because he talks about the Hebrew Scriptures. Likely his father was a Levitical priest. And then the kicker is Mark also knows Latin, and we're going to get to why that's such a big deal. And you may, of course, we all know that the Jerusalem that Mark was raised in was occupied territory, was occupied by the Romans, and so there was Roman language around in Jerusalem at the time. Mark is a seriously connected guy, as they say in the mafia. Mark's cousin is St. Barnabas, and it is through his cousin, St. Barnabas, that Mark goes on the first missionary journey. So you may remember that the Acts of the Apostles, which goes basically verses 1 through 9, Peter, and then in the 9th chapter we have the conversion of Paul, and the rest of the story about the gospel to the Gentiles involves 3 missionary journeys by Paul. Mark goes on the first one, and it's to Antioch, and it doesn't go so well. He gets to Cyprus, and he turns around and he goes home, which really seriously chafes Paul, but not Barnabas, who is his cousin, and Barnabas himself is a wealthy man and who is a Levite and a friend of Peter and Paul. Now we know that the fissure between Mark and Paul gets taken care of, because at the end of the gospel we hear in Paul's first letter to Timothy, he says, "Bring Mark, for he is useful in serving me." So Mark is back with Paul in the end of the story. While Mark is not with Paul, through his cousin Barnabas, he gets to be good friends with St. Peter. And in fact, we are going to hear in first letter, Peter writing, "Your sister church in Babylon," that's in Rome, "chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark." So this is his spiritual son, Peter being that close. And to understand the story, we have to remember what we all know. We all know this. Jesus spent much of his life in Galilee. The incidents of his death take place in Jerusalem. And that's, we would say, we understand Jesus as dying in 32 or 33. But by the year 60, in the 60s, Peter, Paul, and Mark are all in Rome. And tradition has it, early tradition has it, that Mark is Peter's translator and interpreter. Peter, as we know, is a fisherman. He doesn't know Latin, and he doesn't know Greek very well. And Mark is what they call in Greek is hermeneutes, his translator. We also know that, or think we know, that at the end of Mark's life, he's in Alexandria in Egypt. And it's important for us to remember that the gospel coming to Egypt was a big deal, and this was in Alexandria. And what happened in Alexandria had an enormous impact on the theological life of Christianity. And that Mark was, in some sense, the beginning and the father of the anchorites, the movement into the desert, desert spirituality. We hear about that term. And much of what we consider Christian spirituality comes from the desert fathers and mothers who sort of grew out of Mark's church. And tradition has it that Mark was killed, martyred in Alexandria, dragged behind a horse through the streets. And then many centuries later, in 828, Mark's relics were stolen, and they were brought to Venice, where, of course, many of you have been to St. Mark's, the Basilica there, St. Mark's Cathedral, and you would see in front of the altar the relics, the bones of St. Mark. So there's Mark's life. Now it's a little bit about the gospel that we center ourselves around. It's almost impossible to overestimate the importance and the impact of Mark's gospel. Mark is the creator of a genre. There is no such thing as a gospel before Mark compiles it, kind of puts it in order and writes it down. Remember that there is all sorts of oral tradition and sayings, and Mark puts them together. We always need to keep in mind the Gospels are theographies, right? They're not biographies as we have them. They're not histories. It's not about exact dates and places, exact quotations. It's not about collecting all the relevant data. It's the theological telling of the story of Jesus of Nazareth. And the story is written, as it says at the end of John's Gospel, the writer of John's Gospel, John, says to us that he has written us that we might come to believe in Jesus and have life in his name. And the same thing could be said about Mark's Gospel, except that Mark uses the word faith and John uses the word believe. Neither of them use each other's words here. And not only is Mark's Gospel the first Gospel, as I think most or all of you know, almost the whole of Mark's Gospel is in the Gospel according to Luke and in the Gospel according to Matthew. There's 660 or 661 verses in Mark, and over 600 verses of each of Mark's Gospels and each of the other Gospels. So he has an enormous impact on the Synoptic Gospels. And tradition has it, and even scholars agree to a great degree, the attestation of the ancient church was super widespread on this, that the gospel according to Mark is really the gospel according to St. Peter. And that as Peter's translator, Mark told these stories over and over and over and over. And if you read the gospel closely, you see Peter's everywhere in the gospel. He's the first disciple mentioned, the last disciple mentioned. It's Peter, and Peter telling the stories as he recalls them. And the sense of eyewitness testimony in the gospel, which comes when, like reading poetry, little things begin to pop out. And the gospel bears so many of Peter's sensibility. Peter's not a subtle guy, right? And the gospel, according to Mark, is not a subtle gospel. Bang, bang, bang. And the eyewitness details, there's a long list of those, but there's specific times when things happen. There's green grass in this spot at the multiplication of the loaves. There's the cushion on the back of the boat when the stilling of the sea. And all of the details about what happened at the Last Supper. And even in the gospel that Father John just read us this morning, I'll just bring you to one sentence to give you some sense of this. And this is in that crazy, absolutely awesome story of Jesus healing the deaf and mute man, where he spits on his hand and puts his hand, grabs his tongue. I love that stuff. Jesus is a very earthy guy. And it says, then looking up to heaven, he sighed. Okay, oh, wow, that was like a lamest translation. Sighed. I sigh when I have too much to do. That's not what's going on here. This is like a soul groan and a moan. And the only other time we get that word is when in Romans 8, when Paul says that our souls pray without ceasing with sighs, groans, moans, too deep for words. And that's what Jesus is doing. And then he said, Ephatha. And we get the Aramaic word that Jesus would have used. But then Mark has to translate all that because the people in Rome don't know any Aramaic, and he says, means be opened. So tradition has it that the gospel was written in Rome. And just to go back to your high school history classes, the First Jerusalem War was between 66 and 70. That resulted in the destruction of the temple, and that's in Jerusalem. But in Rome, tremendous persecution from Nero. Now, as you remember, in 64, Rome burnt, and it really, really, really burnt. Rome was split into 14 different districts. 10 of those districts were burnt to the ground. And Nero, who was not exactly a balanced guy, of course, blames the Christians, as you know. And if you've been to Rome and you go on a pilgrimage, as we did when we run the St. Francis pilgrimage, you will remember that tradition has it that St. Paul is beheaded in Rome in the year 64. And also that Peter is crucified in Rome around the same time. You may remember the story, maybe you've been there, that while the city is burning, Peter leaves the city. And while he's walking away on the so-called Appian Way, he is confronted by the resurrected Christ, and you have the famous Quo Vadis? Where are you going? Peter asking Jesus, Quo Vadis? Where are you headed? And Jesus says to him, I'm going to Rome. I'm going back to be crucified. And at that, Peter turns around and heads back into Rome. Now, those of you who have been on the Appian Way, you know that there's a church that venerates right where they believe Peter turned around and headed back to Rome. And Peter is crucified upside down because he doesn't feel worthy to be crucified like his Lord. And the whole of Mark's gospel is about essentially discipleship. And well, the first half is about who is Jesus, and then the rest of it's about discipleship and suffering. That's what it's about. John the Baptist is beheaded, Jesus is crucified, and the disciples can expect the same. And the Markan community in the 60s is receiving the same. Other evidence of the Roman roots of the gospel are that Mark's time in the Roman way, not in the Jewish way. He explains Jewish customs. He translates Aramaic expressions. He uses more Latin terminology than all the other gospels put together. He talks about centurions, and he names Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And we know from St. Paul's letter to the Romans that Rufus is an honored Christian in Rome at the time. So there's a lot to that. We also know that Mark's gospel is the shortest of the gospels, by a lot, in fact. Now, if you're following along in the podcast, now that we've done the whole 3-year cycle, and the cycle for this Sunday is the completion of the 3-year cycle, you will remember perhaps at some point this characterization that Mark, the gospel according to Mark, is like the script for an action movie. It begins, bam, with John the Baptist proclaiming. That's the bottom piece in the reredos here, in that little teardroppy shape. That's John the Baptist baptizing. It begins with action, and it goes action throughout the whole gospel. Matthew's gospel, on the other hand, is kind of like an educational and instructional video. It's very down to earth, and it has the Torah, the 5 groups of teachings in it, and that was the catechism for the early church. John's gospel is like a fantasy movie. It begins in the heavens. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the image of John's gospel is the soaring eagle. John's gospel soars. And then Luke, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, tells us in verse 5 to dear Theophilus, he's going to write an orderly account. And so Luke's gospel is like a documentary narrative, a kind of history narrative. And the symbol for Mark is the winged lion, which you see all over our things. It's part of our parish thumbprint is the winged lion. And the lion representing many things, but it is in part that the gospel begins with a roar, it roars throughout the whole thing, and it ends with a roar. So Luke is orderly, John has his head in the heavens, Matthew talks the talk, and Mark walks the walk. And so to finish up on this patronal Sunday, perhaps at some point we might all reflect in the spirit of Mark, how are we doing walking the walk?